They say you never really know someone until you live with them. But I thought I knew my sister better than anyone in the world. We'd shared secrets, dreams, and even boyfriend's hoodies growing up. So when I found my missing wedding ring nestled between her diamond earrings and pearl necklace, my first thought wasn't betrayal. It was confusion. Then I saw the messages on her phone, and my entire world cracked open like an egg hitting concrete. My name is Sarah, and this is the story of how I discovered that the person I trusted most had been systematically destroying my marriage from the inside out, and how sometimes the most devastating betrayals come wrapped in the prettiest packages. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I should have known something was wrong when my husband David started working late every night for 3 weeks straight. Not the occasional late meeting or deadline crunch that comes with being a marketing director at a tech startup, but every single night, coming home after I'd already eaten dinner alone and fallen asleep watching Netflix on the couch. David and I had been married for 2 years, together for 5, and I thought I knew his patterns. He was the type of person who texted me throughout the day, who called during his lunch break just to hear my voice, who brought me coffee in bed every Saturday morning without fail. The sudden distance felt like a winter coat thrown over our relationship when I wasn't expecting the temperature to drop. But Emma, my younger sister by 3 years, had a perfectly reasonable explanation for everything. Maybe he's planning something special for your anniversary, she suggested over lunch at our usual spot, a little cafe downtown that served overpriced salads and the best chocolate croissants in the city. Men get weird when they're trying to be romantic. Remember how secretive Jake got before he proposed to me? I wanted to believe her. Emma had always been the optimist in our family, the one who saw silver linings in thunderclouds and found reasons to celebrate even the smallest victories. When our parents divorced when I was 16 and she was 13, Emma was the one who convinced me that having 2 Christmases would be twice as fun. When I got rejected from my dream college, she spent the entire night researching backup schools and ended up finding me a program that turned out to be even better than my first choice. She was also the most beautiful person I knew, not just physically, though she definitely won the genetic lottery with her naturally blonde hair and bright blue eyes that seemed to catch light even in dimly lit rooms. Emma had this quality that made people gravitate toward her like she was the sun, and everyone else was just planets hoping to bask in her warmth. She could walk into a room full of strangers and leave with 5 new best friends and 3 job offers. Growing up, I'd watched boys stumble over themselves trying to get her attention, and later, men would literally stop mid-conversation when she passed by on the street. But Emma never seemed to let it go to her head. She was generous with compliments, remembered everyone's birthday, and had a way of making you feel like you were the most interesting person in the room when she was talking to you. Maybe that's why I never questioned her advice about David. When someone you love and trust tells you that everything is going to be okay, you want to believe them, especially when the alternative is confronting the possibility that your marriage might be falling apart before you even hit the 3-year mark. The first real sign that something was seriously wrong came on a Thursday evening in October. I'd made David's favorite dinner, honey garlic salmon with roasted vegetables, thinking that maybe a nice home-cooked meal would help us reconnect. I'd even lit candles and opened a bottle of wine, going for the kind of romantic dinner that we used to have regularly when we were first dating. David came home at 9:30, which was actually early for him recently, but by then the salmon was cold and the vegetables had shriveled up in the oven. He apologized profusely, reheated his plate in the microwave, and ate while scrolling through his phone, responding to what he said were urgent emails from clients. I sat across from him at our dining room table, the one we'd picked out together at a furniture store in Brooklyn, spending an entire Saturday testing chairs and debating wood finishes because we wanted everything to be perfect for our first real home together. Now I felt like I was eating dinner with a stranger who happened to look exactly like my husband. David used to put his phone away during meals. It was one of his rules, something he'd insisted on even when we were just dating. He said that food and conversation were sacred, that the rest of the world could wait for an hour while we focused on each other. Now he was typing responses between bites, his attention somewhere else entirely. Is everything okay at work? I asked, trying to keep my voice light and conversational rather than accusatory. You seem really stressed lately. He looked up from his phone with an expression that seemed almost guilty, like I'd caught him doing something he shouldn't have been doing. Then he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes the way his real smiles usually did. "Just a big project," he said. "New client, tight deadline. You know how it is. It should calm down in a few weeks." But it didn't calm down. If anything, it got worse. David started leaving for work earlier and coming home later. He stopped texting me during the day, stopped calling during lunch breaks, stopped bringing me coffee on Saturday mornings. When I tried to initiate physical affection, he seemed distracted, like his mind was somewhere else even when his body was right there next to me. The worst part was how polite he'd become. David used to tease me about my terrible morning hair and my habit of singing off-key in the shower. He'd steal bites of my food and leave his socks on the bedroom floor and complain when I watched romantic comedies because he said they were unrealistic. All the little irritations and intimacies that come with really knowing someone and choosing to love them anyway. Now he was treating me like a house guest he was trying to impress. He complimented my cooking with the kind of generic praise you'd give to a restaurant server. He asked about my day with the polite interest of someone making small talk at a networking event. He started doing his own laundry and picking up after himself with an efficiency that felt more like avoidance than consideration. I confided in Emma because she was the only person I trusted completely with something this fragile and frightening. We were getting our nails done at the salon we'd been going to since high school, one of those sister bonding rituals that we'd maintained even as our lives had gotten busier and more complicated. Emma listened while I described David's strange behavior, how distant he'd become, how it felt like he was slowly disappearing from our marriage even though he was still physically present. She asked thoughtful questions about his work stress, about whether there might be family issues he wasn't telling me about whether I'd done anything that might have upset him without realizing it. "Have you tried planning something special?" she suggested as the nail technician painted her nails a soft pink that somehow looked sophisticated rather than juvenile. "Maybe surprise him with something that reminds him why he fell in love with you in the first place." The suggestion stung a little, implying that maybe I wasn't trying hard enough to keep my husband's attention, but I knew Emma meant well. She'd always been a problem solver, someone who believed that most relationship issues could be fixed with better communication or more effort or the right romantic gesture. I took her advice and planned a weekend getaway to the bed and breakfast where David and I had spent our first anniversary. I made reservations, packed our bags, and presented the whole thing to him as a surprise on Friday evening, thinking that getting away from work and routine might help us rediscover each other. David's reaction was not what I'd hoped for. Instead of excitement or gratitude, he looked almost panicked, like I'd just told him I'd accidentally set the house on fire. "This weekend?" he asked, his voice tight with what sounded like anxiety. "Sarah, I can't just drop everything and leave town. I have responsibilities, deadlines." "It's 2 days," I said, trying to keep the hurt out of my voice. "You haven't taken a break in months. Your boss will understand." "You don't get it," he snapped, and the sharp tone was so unlike him that I actually took a step backward. "I have commitments. I can't just run away whenever I feel like it." The word commitments hit me like a slap. Since when did spending time with your wife count as running away? Since when did a romantic weekend become an irresponsible escape from reality? I canceled the reservation and spent that weekend cleaning our apartment with the kind of aggressive efficiency that comes from needing to do something, anything, with the nervous energy that had nowhere else to go. David worked both days, leaving early and coming home late, as if our fight had given him permission to be even more absent than before. Emma came over on Sunday evening with takeout from my favorite Thai restaurant and a bottle of wine. She found me sitting on our couch in the same pajamas I'd been wearing for 2 days, surrounded by the debris of my weekend cleaning spree. "He's definitely going through something," she said after I told her about the failed weekend plans. "But that doesn't mean it's about you or your marriage. Sometimes men just need space to work through their issues." She curled up next to me on the couch, and I felt grateful for her presence, for the familiar comfort of having someone who knew me well enough to show up without being asked. Emma had always been good at that, appearing exactly when I needed her most with exactly what I needed, whether it was chocolate ice cream after a bad breakup or a listening ear after a fight with our mother. "Maybe you should give him some space," she continued, pouring wine into the glasses I'd forgotten to wash from earlier in the week. Stop trying so hard to fix whatever's wrong and let him figure it out on his own. It felt like giving up, but I was exhausted from trying to bridge a gap that seemed to be widening every day despite my efforts. So I took Emma's advice and stopped planning romantic dinners and surprise gestures. I stopped asking David about his day when he clearly didn't want to talk about it. I stopped trying to initiate physical intimacy when it was obvious that he wasn't interested. Instead, I focused on my own life. I started working out more regularly, taking evening yoga classes that made me feel centered and strong. I reconnected with friends I'd been neglecting, accepted invitations to girls' nights and book clubs and weekend brunches. I threw myself into my job as a graphic designer for a small marketing firm, taking on extra projects and staying late to perfect campaigns that probably didn't need perfecting. But even as I built a fuller, more independent life, the distance between David and me continued to grow. We started living like roommates who happened to share a lease and a last name. We were polite and considerate, but there was no warmth, no intimacy, no sense that we were partners working together toward common goals. The worst part was how normal it started to feel. Humans are incredibly adaptable creatures, and I found myself adjusting to this new reality where my husband was essentially a polite stranger who shared my bed, but not my life. I stopped expecting him to be present for dinner conversations. I stopped hoping he'd want to spend weekends together. I stopped believing that things would go back to the way they used to be. Emma continued to be my closest confidant through all of this. She listened to my frustrations without judgment, offered advice that seemed practical and wise, and reminded me that all marriages went through difficult phases. She'd gone through her own relationship challenges with Jake, her fiancé of 6 months, and she shared stories about how they'd worked through communication problems and trust issues. "You and David have such a strong foundation," she would say during our weekly coffee dates. "You've been through so much together. This is just a rough patch, and rough patches don't last forever if you're committed to working through them." I wanted to believe her, but it was getting harder and harder to see evidence of that strong foundation she kept referring to. David and I barely spoke beyond the logistics of shared household responsibilities. We hadn't been physically intimate in over a month. He spent most of his free time either working or doing things that didn't include me, like going to the gym or meeting up with friends from work. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in November. I'd been working late on a particularly challenging project, trying to create a visual identity for a new restaurant that wanted something sophisticated but approachable, elegant but not intimidating. I was in that flow state that every creative person craves, when the ideas are coming easily and everything you touch seems to turn out exactly right. I lost track of time and didn't realize how late it had gotten until I looked up from my computer and saw that it was almost 9 o'clock. For the first time in weeks, I was going to be the one coming home late, the one who needed to apologize for missing dinner and being absent. Part of me was curious to see how David would react. Would he be worried about me? Would he have tried calling or texting to make sure I was okay? Would he understand what it felt like to be on the other side of this dynamic for once? I gathered my things and drove home through the quiet streets of our neighborhood, past the coffee shop where David and I used to meet for breakfast on Sunday mornings, past the park where we'd had our first real conversation about getting married, past all the landmarks of a relationship that felt like it belonged to different people entirely. Our apartment was dark when I pulled into the parking space next to David's car. No lights in the windows, no warm glow spilling out to welcome me home. I climbed the stairs to our second-floor unit, and used my key as quietly as possible, thinking that maybe David had fallen asleep on the couch waiting for me. But the apartment was empty. David's work bag was by the front door, his jacket hung on the hook where he always left it, but he was nowhere to be found. I called his name, checked our bedroom, looked in the bathroom, even opened the door to our small home office, but the apartment was definitely empty. I tried calling his phone, but it went straight to voicemail. I sent a text asking where he was, and if he was okay, then sat down on our couch to wait for a response that never came. David didn't come home until almost midnight. I heard his key in the lock, and pretended to be asleep on the couch, curled up under the throw blanket we'd bought together at a craft fair during our first year of marriage. I listened to him move around the apartment, heard him brush his teeth and change into pajamas, felt the bed shift when he finally came to sleep. In the morning, he acted like nothing unusual had happened. When I asked where he'd been the night before, he said he'd gone out for drinks with coworkers and his phone had died.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The explanation was plausible, even reasonable, but something about the way he delivered it felt rehearsed, like he'd been practicing what to say if I asked. That's when I started paying closer attention to the details. David's phone, which used to always be charging on his nightstand, was now carefully placed face down on his dresser, far enough away that I couldn't see if notifications were coming through. He'd changed his passcode from our anniversary date to something I didn't know. He started taking his phone with him everywhere, even to the bathroom, even when he was just going to the kitchen to get a glass of water. He was also more careful about his appearance than he'd ever been during our relationship. David had always been attractive in that effortless way that some men manage to pull off, but he'd never been particularly vain or focused on his looks. Now he was spending longer in the bathroom getting ready for work, using hair products I'd never seen before, wearing cologne that smelled different from the one I'd bought him for his birthday. When I mentioned these changes to Emma, she had explanations for everything. Maybe he's trying to make a good impression at work because he's hoping for a promotion. Maybe he's going through some kind of midlife crisis and wants to feel more confident about himself. Maybe he's finally learned how to dress better, and you should be happy about that instead of suspicious. Emma's logic always sounded reasonable when she was explaining it to me, but alone in my apartment at night, listening to David talk quietly on his phone in our home office with the door closed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with my marriage. The final straw came when I realized my wedding ring was missing. It was a simple white gold band with 3 small diamonds, nothing flashy or expensive, but it was mine and I loved it. David had saved for months to buy it, working extra hours and skipping lunches to afford something that would represent his commitment to me. I noticed it was gone on a Saturday morning when I was getting dressed to meet Emma for brunch. I always took my ring off before showering and left it on the bathroom counter, but when I reached for it that morning, the counter was empty. I checked the sink drain, looked under the bathroom rug, searched through the jewelry box on my dresser, but the ring was nowhere to be found. I spent the entire morning before brunch tearing apart our bedroom and bathroom, looking in every possible place the ring might have fallen or been accidentally moved. I checked inside pillowcases and under furniture cushions, emptied every drawer and searched through every pocket of every piece of clothing I'd worn recently. David was at the gym, his new Saturday morning routine that had replaced our old tradition of lazy mornings in bed reading the news and drinking coffee. When he came home and found me sitting on our bedroom floor, surrounded by the contents of every drawer and cabinet I owned, he seemed more annoyed than concerned. "What's all this?" he asked, gesturing at the chaos I'd created in my search. "My ring is missing," I said, and I heard my own voice crack with frustration and something that felt dangerously close to despair. "I can't find it anywhere." I expected him to immediately start helping me look, to share my concern about losing something so important. Instead, David just stood in the doorway of our bedroom, still in his gym clothes, looking at me like I was being dramatic about something trivial. "It'll turn up," he said, with a shrug. "Things don't just disappear, you probably just put it somewhere different than usual." But I didn't put it somewhere different. I always put my ring in the same place, had been putting it in the same place every single night for 2 years. The idea that I would suddenly change this routine and then forget about it was so unlike me that even suggesting it felt like David didn't know me at all anymore. "I'm going to be late for brunch with Emma," I said, because I didn't know what else to say, and because the way David was looking at me was making me feel foolish for caring so much about a piece of jewelry. David nodded and headed toward the bathroom for his shower, stepping carefully around the piles of belongings I'd scattered across the floor in my search. As I heard the water start running, I felt a loneliness so profound that it took my breath away. This was my husband, the person who was supposed to care about the things that mattered to me, and he was treating the loss of our wedding ring like I'd misplaced a grocery list. Emma was already seated at our usual table when I arrived at the brunch place, looking perfectly put together in a way that I envied and appreciated in equal measure. She had this ability to make even casual weekend clothes look intentional and stylish, whereas I always felt like I was playing dress-up in my own life. You look upset, she said immediately, because Emma had always been good at reading people's emotions, especially mine. What's wrong? I told her about the missing ring, about David's dismissive reaction, about how alone I felt in my own marriage. Emma listened with the kind of focused attention that made me remember why I loved having her in my life, why I'd always felt like she was the one person who truly understood me. That's so strange, she said when I finished explaining everything I'd done to try to find the ring. Are you sure you didn't take it off somewhere else? Maybe at work, or when you were at the gym. I was sure, but Emma's questions made me doubt myself. Maybe I was being careless without realizing it. Maybe the stress of my deteriorating marriage was making me absent-minded about things that used to be automatic. We should retrace your steps, Emma suggested. Think about everywhere you've been in the past few days, everyone you've seen. Maybe someone found it and is waiting to return it to you. So that's what we did. After brunch, Emma came with me to every place I'd been in the past week. We went to my office and searched my desk, my car, the gym where I'd been taking yoga classes. We stopped by the coffee shop where I sometimes worked on freelance projects, asked the baristas if anyone had turned in a lost ring. Everyone was sympathetic and helpful, but no one had seen my ring. By the end of the day, I was exhausted and discouraged, and Emma suggested that maybe we should expand the search to my apartment one more time, looking in places that wouldn't normally occur to me. Emma had been to my apartment hundreds of times over the years, but this time she approached it like a detective, methodically checking areas that I might have overlooked. She looked inside books and under couch cushions, checked the pockets of jackets hanging in our hall closet, even looked inside the refrigerator in case I'd been distracted while cooking and accidentally put the ring down in a strange place. Why don't you check David's stuff? She suggested when we'd exhausted all the obvious possibilities. Maybe it got mixed up with his things somehow. The idea hadn't occurred to me, probably because David and I kept our personal belongings pretty separate. He had his own dresser, his own side of the closet, his own nightstand. But Emma was right that sometimes things got mixed up, especially small things like jewelry that could easily fall into the wrong drawer or get picked up by mistake. We started with David's nightstand, carefully going through the drawers that contained his watch, his wallet when he wasn't carrying it, random charging cables and receipts, and all the small debris that accumulates in bedside storage. No ring, but I did find a receipt from a restaurant I'd never heard of, dated from the previous week when David had supposedly been working late. The receipt was for 2 dinners, 2 glasses of wine, and a dessert. Either David had developed a much larger appetite than I'd realized, or he'd been having dinner with someone else. Someone he hadn't mentioned to me. Emma found the receipt at the same time I did, and I watched her face carefully as she read it. For just a moment, her expression changed in a way that I couldn't interpret, like she was surprised or concerned, or maybe even guilty about something. But then she looked at me with the same supportive, caring expression she'd been wearing all day. Maybe it was a work dinner, she said, though her voice lacked the confidence of her usual explanations for David's behavior. You know how those startup guys are always networking and meeting with clients. Maybe I agreed, but I folded the receipt and put it in my pocket anyway. It felt like evidence of something, even if I wasn't sure what yet. We moved on to David's dresser, and that's where Emma opened the top drawer and immediately went very still. Sarah, she said, and her voice sounded strange, almost breathless. I think we found it. I looked over her shoulder into the drawer, and there it was. My wedding ring, sitting next to David's cufflinks and tie clips like it belonged there, like it was just another piece of jewelry in his collection. For a moment I felt nothing but relief. The ring wasn't lost, wasn't gone forever, wasn't sitting at the bottom of a drain, or in a trash can somewhere. It was right here in my own apartment, exactly where it should be. But then the questions started. How had my ring ended up in David's dresser drawer? I never put jewelry in his furniture, never had any reason to open those drawers at all. David didn't handle my jewelry, didn't have any reason to move my ring from the bathroom counter to his own storage space. Emma was staring at the ring with an expression I couldn't read, and when I reached past her to pick it up, she grabbed my wrist. Wait, she said, don't touch it yet. Why not? It's my ring, because Emma said slowly, if David moved it here for some reason, we should probably ask him about it first. Find out why it's here before we disturb anything. The suggestion made sense, but something about Emma's tone bothered me. She sounded less like someone who was trying to help me solve a mystery and more like someone who was trying to prevent me from discovering something I wasn't supposed to know. I picked up my ring despite her objection and slipped it back onto my finger where it belonged. But as we closed David's dresser drawer and left his side of the bedroom exactly as we'd found it, I couldn't shake the feeling that finding my ring had raised more questions than it had answered. That night, I waited for David to come home so I could ask him about the ring, about how it had ended up in his dresser drawer. But David didn't come home until after I'd fallen asleep, and in the morning he was gone before I woke up. He left a note saying he had an early meeting and would probably be working late again. The note was written on a piece of paper torn from a legal pad, and David's handwriting looked rushed and careless. But at the bottom, almost like an afterthought, he'd written "love you" in a way that looked forced, like he'd remembered at the last second that husbands were supposed to sign notes to their wives with some expression of affection. I spent that entire day thinking about the ring, about the restaurant receipt, about all the small changes in David's behavior that I'd been trying to explain away for months. Emma's voice kept echoing in my head, all her reasonable explanations and gentle suggestions that I was probably overreacting to normal relationship struggles. But what if I wasn't overreacting? What if my instincts had been right all along, and David was hiding something much bigger than work stress or midlife crisis anxiety? That evening, I made a decision that would change everything. David had left his laptop open on the kitchen counter, something he never usually did. He was always careful about closing it and putting it away, just like he was careful about his phone and his changed passcode and all the other small securities that had appeared in our relationship lately. I stood in front of the laptop for probably 10 minutes, knowing that looking at it would cross a line that I couldn't uncross. Once I invaded David's privacy, once I went searching for evidence of betrayal, there would be no going back to the innocent trust that had defined our marriage for years. But I also knew that I couldn't continue living in this limbo of suspicion and doubt. I needed to either confirm my fears or put them to rest, needed to know whether I was losing my mind or whether my husband was lying to me about fundamental aspects of his life. I opened the laptop. David's email inbox told a story I wasn't prepared to read. There were messages from his boss about projects I'd never heard him mention, confirmations for business dinners at restaurants I didn't recognize, and a thread of emails with someone named Marcus about weekend plans that apparently didn't include me. But it was the folder labeled personal that made my hands shake as I clicked on it. The emails were organized by sender, and there at the top was a name that made my stomach drop to somewhere around my feet. My sister had been emailing my husband, not just occasionally, not just forwarding funny memes or family updates, but regularly. Daily, sometimes multiple times a day. The timestamps showed conversations happening during work hours, late at night, early in the morning. Times when I thought David was busy with his job or asleep next to me in our bed. I clicked on the most recent email, dated just 3 days ago, and felt the world tilt sideways. David, I can't stop thinking about last night. The way you looked at me when Sarah went to get dessert, I almost forgot we were supposed to be pretending nothing was happening. This is getting harder and harder to hide. I know we agreed to wait until after the holidays to tell her, but I'm not sure I can keep acting normal around her much longer. She's starting to ask questions about why you've been so distant, and I'm running out of excuses to give her. Maybe we should just tell her the truth. She deserves that much, doesn't she? I read the email 3 times before the words actually penetrated. Last night David had been at work, or at least that's what he'd told me. Last night, I'd eaten leftover pasta alone while watching a cooking show, wondering why my husband couldn't even be bothered to call and let me know he'd be late again. Last night, apparently he'd been with my sister. My fingers moved without conscious direction, scrolling through more emails, each one revealing another piece of a puzzle that was forming a picture I never could have imagined. There were messages about meeting times and locations, careful discussions about what to tell me when I asked where they'd been, debates about whether they should keep seeing each other or try to stop before things went too far. Things had already gone too far. Much too far. Emma, you looked incredible today.
I couldn't concentrate on anything Sarah was saying at lunch because I kept thinking about how you smiled at me when she wasn't looking. This is driving me crazy. I know we said we'd be careful, but when you touch my hand like that, I forget about everything else. I forget about being married, about what this could do to our families, about everything except how much I want to be with you. That email was from 2 weeks ago after a lunch that I remembered clearly. The three of us had gone to a new Italian place that Emma had wanted to try, and I'd felt happy to have both of them there, happy to share a meal with the two people I loved most in the world. I'd even taken a picture of the three of us together, posting it on social media with a caption about feeling grateful for family. While I was feeling grateful, my husband and my sister were apparently falling in love with each other right in front of me. I kept reading, each email like a knife twisting deeper into wounds I didn't even know I had. There were discussions about guilt, about loyalty, about how they never meant for this to happen but couldn't seem to stop it from happening anyway. There were messages about how beautiful Emma was, how David had always been attracted to her but had chosen me instead, and how they both wondered what their lives would have been like if they'd met under different circumstances. I need you to know that this isn't about Sarah not being enough. David had written in one email, "She's a good person, a good wife, but she's not you. She's never been you. Sometimes I think I married her because she was safe, because I knew she'd never leave me or hurt me or challenge me to be better than I am. But you make me want to be the man I always thought I could be." The words felt like being punched in the chest. David had married me because I was safe, because I was predictable and non-threatening and wouldn't push him outside his comfort zone. He'd chosen security over passion, familiarity over excitement, and now he'd found with my sister what he realized he'd been missing with me. But the emails that hurt the most were the ones from Emma. My sister, who had been giving me advice about my marriage, who had been telling me to be patient with David's distance, who had been assuring me that everything would work out if I just gave him space to figure things out. "David, I feel so guilty about lying to Sarah, but I also can't bring myself to regret what's happening between us. Today she asked me if I thought you might be having an affair, and I had to sit there and tell her she was being paranoid while knowing that she was absolutely right. I'm a terrible sister and an even worse person, but I can't stop wanting you. I can't stop thinking about the way you kiss me, the way you say my name, the way you make me feel like I'm the only woman in the world who matters." I closed the laptop and ran to the bathroom, barely making it to the toilet before I threw up everything I'd eaten that day. My body was rejecting the information as violently as my mind was, trying to purge the knowledge that the two people I trusted most had been systematically betraying me for months. When the nausea passed, I sat on our bathroom floor and tried to process what I'd learned. This wasn't a brief moment of weakness or a single mistake that they'd both immediately regretted. This was an ongoing affair, complete with declarations of love and plans for the future and discussions about how to handle telling me the truth. They were planning to leave me, not just David, but Emma too. My sister was planning to take my husband and destroy my marriage, and she'd been helping me cope with the destruction she was causing. I thought about all the times Emma had listened to me cry about David's distance, all the advice she'd given me about being patient and understanding, all the reassurances that my marriage was strong enough to survive whatever rough patch we were going through. She'd been sabotaging me while pretending to support me, watching me struggle to save a relationship that she was actively destroying. The cruelest part was how good she'd been at it. Emma had managed to be the perfect supportive sister while conducting an affair with my husband. She'd given me just enough hope to keep me from giving up on David while making sure I never got too close to discovering what was really happening. I sat on that bathroom floor for what felt like hours, cycling through disbelief and rage and grief and back to disbelief again. Part of me kept waiting to wake up from what had to be the worst nightmare of my life. Part of me kept thinking that I must have misunderstood the emails, that there had to be some other explanation for what I'd read, but the evidence was overwhelming. The emails were too detailed, too intimate, too consistent to be anything other than exactly what they appeared to be. My husband was having an affair with my sister, and they were both lying to my face about it every single day.
When I finally got up from the bathroom floor, I felt different. Not just heartbroken or angry, but fundamentally changed in a way that I knew would be permanent. The Sarah who had trusted blindly and loved completely was gone, replaced by someone harder and more suspicious and infinitely sadder. I went back to David's laptop and took screenshots of the most damning emails, forwarding them to my own email account so I'd have evidence of what I'd discovered. Then I closed the laptop and placed it exactly where David had left it, erasing any trace that I'd been there. David came home around 11 that night, smelling like wine and Emma's perfume, though I don't think he realized that I could detect either scent. He tried to kiss me hello, but I turned my head so his lips hit my cheek instead of my mouth. I couldn't bear the thought of kissing lips that had been on my sister's mouth. "Sorry I'm late," he said, and his voice sounded guilty in a way that I now understood had nothing to do with work obligations. Client dinner ran long. I nodded and said something about having eaten already, about being tired, about wanting to go to bed early. David seemed relieved that I wasn't asking questions or trying to engage him in conversation. He grabbed a beer from the refrigerator and settled onto the couch with his phone, probably texting Emma about how their secret was still safe. I lay in our bed that night, listening to David's breathing and wondering how long this had been going on. When had it started? Had they been attracted to each other from the beginning, or had something changed recently that brought them together? Had there been signs that I'd missed, moments when they'd looked at each other differently or touched each other in ways that were inappropriate for a brother-in-law and sister-in-law? I thought about Emma's relationship with Jake, her fiancé who seemed to adore her and was planning their wedding for the following spring. Was she going to leave him too, or was she planning to carry on affairs with both Jake and David simultaneously? The Emma I thought I knew would never be capable of that level of deception, but apparently the Emma I thought I knew didn't exist at all. The next morning, David left for work before I woke up, which was becoming his normal pattern. He left another note, this one saying he'd be home late again because of a company meeting. I wondered if Emma would be at this fictional meeting, if they had plans to spend the evening together while I sat at home wondering why my marriage was falling apart. I called in sick to work, something I never did unless I was actually physically ill, and spent the day trying to figure out what to do with the information I'd discovered. Should I confront them immediately? Should I gather more evidence? Should I call a lawyer and start divorce proceedings without giving David a chance to explain himself? Part of me wanted to drive straight to Emma's apartment and demand answers. Part of me wanted to pack David's bags and leave them on the front porch with a note telling him never to come back. But a bigger part of me felt paralyzed by the magnitude of what I'd learned, overwhelmed by the number of decisions I'd have to make, and the number of lives that would be permanently changed by whatever I chose to do next. Emma called me around noon, her voice bright and cheerful in a way that now sounded completely fake to my ears. "Hey, how are you feeling today?" she asked. "You seemed really upset yesterday about the ring thing." The ring thing, as if discovering that my wedding ring had mysteriously appeared in my husband's dresser drawer was just a minor inconvenience rather than evidence of something seriously wrong with my marriage. "I'm fine," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral, "just tired." "You know what?" Emma said, and I could hear her smile through the phone. "Why don't we do something fun tonight? Jake's working late, and you said David's been busy with work stuff. We could go see that new movie you wanted to watch, maybe grab dinner somewhere nice." The suggestion filled me with a rage so pure and clean that it actually surprised me. Emma wanted to spend the evening with me while David was probably planning to spend the evening with her. She wanted to sit next to me in a movie theater and share popcorn and pretend to be my loving sister while she was actively destroying my life. "Actually," I said, "I think I'm going to stay home tonight, maybe catch up on some work, get to bed early." There was a pause on Emma's end of the line, and when she spoke again, her voice sounded different. More careful, more calculated. "Are you sure?" she asked. "You've been spending a lot of time alone lately. I worry about you." The concern in her voice was so convincing that for a moment I almost forgot what I knew about her. Emma had always been good at projecting empathy and care, and even now, knowing what she was really doing, I could hear what sounded like genuine love in her voice. "I'm sure," I said, "but thanks for thinking of me." After we hung up, I realized that Emma's call had probably been about logistics. She'd needed to know what I was doing tonight so she could make plans with David accordingly. If I'd said yes to the movie, she would have gone with me and found some other time to see my husband. If I'd said I was working late, she might have suggested that David come over to her place instead of meeting somewhere public. They were coordinating their affair around my schedule, making sure their betrayal didn't interfere with my daily routine. The thoughtfulness of it was almost more insulting than the affair itself. I spent the afternoon reading through more of David's emails, going back months to try to understand how this had started. The earliest messages between David and Emma that seemed inappropriate were from 3 months ago, around the time that David had started working late and becoming distant. The first email was from Emma, sent on a Tuesday afternoon in August. David, thank you for listening to me complain about Jake last night. Sarah is so lucky to have someone who actually pays attention when she talks. Jake just nods and makes the right noises, but I can tell he's not really hearing me. It means a lot to have someone who understands what I'm trying to say. David's response was careful but warmer than it should have been between in-laws. Emma, you deserve someone who really sees you. Jake's a good guy, but he doesn't appreciate how incredible you are. Sarah and I were just talking about how smart and talented you are, how you light up every room you walk into. Don't settle for someone who doesn't recognize that. The emails escalated slowly from there. Compliments became more personal, conversations became more intimate, and what started as inappropriate friendliness gradually transformed into emotional infidelity and then physical affair. Reading through the progression was like watching a car accident in slow motion. I could see exactly how it had happened, could trace the path from innocent conversation to relationship-ending betrayal. But understanding how it had started didn't make it hurt any less. What hurt the most was seeing how much David loved her. Not just wanted her or was attracted to her, but genuinely deeply loved her in ways that he'd never loved me. He wrote about how talking to Emma made him feel more like himself than he'd felt in years, how she challenged him to think about things differently, how she made him want to be a better person. He wrote about Emma the way I'd always hoped someone would write about me someday, with passion and admiration and the kind of desperate longing that comes from finding someone who feels like the missing piece of your soul. The emails also revealed that they'd been physical together multiple times. David had a key to Emma's apartment, apparently given to him under the pretense of helping with some home repairs that Jake couldn't handle. They'd been meeting there in the afternoons, when Jake was at work and I thought David was in client meetings. They'd also been together in our apartment, in our bed, while I was at work or at the gym or running errands. The violation of that felt almost worse than the affair itself. They'd been making love in the bed I shared with David, using the home I'd built with my husband as the setting for their betrayal. One email from last week made me physically sick to read. Emma, having you in our bed today was incredible, but it also felt wrong in a way that I can't shake. Not wrong because we shouldn't be together, but wrong because it's not really our space. When we tell Sarah the truth and start our life together, I want us to have a place that belongs just to us, somewhere we can be completely honest about who we are and what we mean to each other. Our bed, our life together. They were already planning their future as a couple, already talking about the apartment they'd share and the life they'd build after they finished destroying mine. I printed out the most damning emails and put them in a folder, then deleted the screenshots from my email account. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with the evidence, but I wanted to have it in case I needed to prove to someone else what had been happening.
That evening, I waited for David to come home with his story about the company meeting that didn't exist. He arrived around 10:30, looking slightly disheveled in a way that suggested he'd been doing more than sitting in a conference room discussing quarterly projections. How was the meeting? I asked, curious to see how creative his lie would be. Boring, he said without meeting my eyes. Just budget stuff, planning for next year. You know how those things are. I did know how those things were, because David had taken me to company events before and I'd met his coworkers and his boss. I knew that his company was too small to have quarterly budget meetings that lasted until 10:30 at night. I knew that David was lying to me with the same casual ease that Emma had been lying to me for months. Did Emma call you today? He asked, and the question surprised me because it was the first time in weeks that David had brought up my sister in conversation. Yes, I said. She wanted to go to a movie, but I wasn't in the mood. David nodded and headed toward the bathroom for his shower, but I caught something in his expression that looked almost like relief.
He'd been worried about what Emma and I might have talked about, worried that I might have said something that would compromise their secret. Later that night, lying in bed next to my husband while he slept peacefully beside me, I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront them immediately. I wasn't going to scream and cry and demand explanations that would probably just be more lies anyway. Instead, I was going to do something that neither David nor Emma would expect from safe, predictable, non-threatening Sarah. I was going to be strategic. I was going to be smart. I was going to make sure that when this all came out, I was the one in control of the narrative. The next morning, I called my friend Rachel, who was a divorce attorney. Rachel and I had met in college and stayed in touch over the years, though we didn't see each other often because of our busy schedules. But I knew she was good at her job and that I could trust her to be discreet about whatever I needed to discuss. "Rachel," I said when she answered her phone, "I need some legal advice, and I need you to keep this conversation completely confidential." "Of course," she said, and her voice immediately became more serious. "What's going on?" "I think my husband is having an affair," I said, and the words felt strange in my mouth, foreign and bitter and completely surreal. "I have evidence, but I'm not sure what to do with it." Rachel asked me to come to her office that afternoon, and I spent the morning preparing for the conversation. I printed out more emails, organized them chronologically, and wrote a timeline of David's behavioral changes over the past few months. When I walked into Rachel's law office, I felt like I was crossing another line that I couldn't uncross. Consulting with a divorce attorney made everything feel more real, more final, more irreversible. Rachel listened to my story without interrupting, occasionally taking notes or asking clarifying questions. When I finished explaining everything I'd discovered, she sat back in her chair and looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and professional assessment. "Sarah," she said, "I'm so sorry this is happening to you. But from a legal standpoint, you're in a relatively strong position. The emails constitute clear evidence of adultery, which could be relevant depending on what state you're in and what kind of settlement you're hoping for. We talked about asset division, about spousal support, about the timeline for divorce proceedings." Rachel explained my options and helped me understand what I could expect if I decided to end my marriage. But she also asked me something that I hadn't fully considered. "Are you sure you want to get divorced?" she said. "Some couples do recover from infidelity. Have you thought about counseling, about trying to work through this?" I had thought about it, briefly, but the idea of sitting in a therapist's office with David and Emma, trying to work through their betrayal while they pretended to be sorry for hurting me, felt impossible to imagine. "Rachel," I said, "this isn't just an affair. This is my husband and my sister, planning a future together while lying to my face every single day. This isn't something that happened once, and they regretted it. This is ongoing deliberate deception by the two people I trusted most in the world." She nodded, understanding the distinction. An affair with a stranger might be something a marriage could survive. An affair with a family member, an affair that involved systematic lying and emotional manipulation, was something else entirely. "What do you want to do?" Rachel asked. "I want to protect myself," I said. "I want to make sure that when this comes out, I'm not the one who gets blamed for the failure of my marriage. I want to make sure that David doesn't get to rewrite history and pretend that our relationship was already over when he started sleeping with my sister." Rachel helped me understand how to document everything properly, how to protect my financial interests, how to prepare for the various ways that David might react when he learned that I knew about the affair. When I left her office, I felt more prepared but also more sad than I'd felt since discovering the truth. Talking to a lawyer had made everything feel inevitable in a way that was both empowering and devastating. That evening, I decided to test my suspicions about David's supposed work obligations. Instead of staying home, I drove to Emma's apartment building and parked across the street where I could see the entrance. I didn't have to wait long. At 7:15, David's car pulled into the parking lot. I watched my husband get out of his vehicle, carrying a bottle of wine and a bouquet of flowers, the kind of romantic gestures that he used to make for me but hadn't made in months. He looked happy in a way that I hadn't seen him look in our apartment for a long time. His walk was lighter, his posture more confident, his entire demeanor more alive than he'd been around me recently. This was David as he truly was when he wasn't forcing himself to pretend to be a devoted husband. I sat in my car for 2 hours, watching the windows of Emma's apartment, seeing shadows move behind the curtains, imagining what they were doing together while I sat alone in a parking lot playing the role of the suspicious wife. When I finally drove home, I felt hollowed out and strangely calm. The last part of me that had been hoping I was wrong, that had been clinging to the possibility that there was some innocent explanation for everything I'd discovered, was finally gone. David came home around midnight, with his usual story about working late. I pretended to be asleep when he slipped into bed beside me, but I could smell Emma's perfume on his skin and feel the satisfaction radiating from his body like heat. Tomorrow, I decided I would start implementing the plan that Rachel and I had discussed. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of taking control of my own life instead of letting David and Emma control it for me. But tonight, I would lie next to my husband one last time and mourn the marriage that I'd thought we had, the sister I'd thought I knew, and the woman I'd been before I learned that love and trust were luxuries that I could no longer afford. The opportunity for confrontation came sooner than I expected. Emma called me Friday afternoon, with an invitation that felt like the universe presenting me with the perfect stage for what needed to happen. "Sarah, Jake and I are having a dinner party tomorrow night," she said, her voice bubbling with the kind of enthusiasm that I now recognized as performance. "Nothing fancy, just a few close friends and family. You and David should come. It'll be fun to have everyone together." A dinner party, at Emma's apartment, where she and David had been conducting their affair, while planning my husband's exit from our marriage. The irony was so perfect that I almost laughed. "That sounds lovely," I said. "What time should we be there?" 7 o'clock. And Sarah, Emma's voice softened in that way that used to make me feel cherished and now made my skin crawl. "I'm really glad we're doing this. I feel like we haven't spent enough quality time together lately." Quality time. While she'd been sleeping with my husband and lying to my face, Emma had been worried about our lack of sister bonding. The audacity was breathtaking. After hanging up, I sat in my office and finalized the plan that had been forming in my mind for the past week. Tomorrow night, in front of witnesses, I would reveal what David and Emma had been doing. Not with screaming or tears or dramatic accusations, but with the cold presentation of facts that would make denial impossible. I'd spent the week preparing meticulously. The most damning emails were printed and organized in a folder. I'd taken screenshots of text message exchanges between David and Emma that I'd found on David's phone when he'd left it unattended during his shower. I'd even driven by Emma's apartment building and taken photos of David's car in her parking lot on 3 separate occasions. But more importantly, I'd prepared myself emotionally for what was coming. The initial shock and grief had crystallized into something harder and more focused. I wasn't the broken wife begging for explanations anymore. I was a woman who had been systematically betrayed by the 2 people she trusted most, and I was going to make sure that everyone knew exactly what kind of people they really were. Saturday evening, I dressed carefully for Emma's dinner party. Not in the understated safe clothes that I'd been wearing lately, but in a red dress that made me look confident and beautiful and completely in control. I wanted to look like a woman who couldn't be pitied, who couldn't be dismissed, who demanded to be taken seriously. David seemed surprised by my appearance when I came out of our bedroom ready to leave. "You look incredible," he said, and for just a moment his voice carried the warmth that I remembered from when he used to actually see me as desirable rather than convenient. "Thank you," I said simply. I wanted to look nice for Emma's party. The drive to Emma's apartment was surreal. David made small talk about work and the weather, completely unaware that I knew he'd been in Emma's bed just 2 days earlier while I was at my yoga class. He seemed relaxed, almost happy, probably looking forward to spending an evening with Emma where they could exchange meaningful looks and secret smiles while I remained obliviously in the dark. Emma's apartment looked perfect when we arrived, decorated with the kind of effortless elegance that she'd always been naturally good at. Candles flickered on surfaces throughout the living room, soft music played from hidden speakers, and the smell of something delicious drifted from the kitchen. Jake greeted us at the door, looking handsome and happy and completely unaware that his fiancée was planning to leave him for my husband. The sight of his genuine smile, his obvious excitement about hosting friends in the home he shared with Emma, made my chest tighten with an emotion that wasn't quite sympathy but wasn't quite anger either. Sarah, Emma appeared from the kitchen, stunning in a black dress that showed off her figure and her perfect smile. She hugged me with apparent warmth, and I forced myself not to recoil from the contact. "You look amazing, that color is perfect on you." She hugged David next, and I watched carefully for any sign of inappropriate intimacy between them. But they were good at this deception, probably had months of practice at acting normally around me. The hug looked exactly like what it should have been, a friendly greeting between in-laws. The other guests were people I knew from various contexts. Jake's co-workers, a few of Emma's friends from college, our cousin Lisa and her husband. Everyone seemed relaxed and happy, ready for an evening of good food and pleasant conversation. I waded through cocktails and appetizers, making small talk and laughing at appropriate moments while internally rehearsing what I was going to say. The folder containing the evidence was in my purse, and every few minutes I could feel its weight against my side like a reminder of what was coming. During dinner, I watched David and Emma interact with the kind of attention I'd never paid before. Now that I knew what to look for, their affair was obvious in a dozen small ways. The way Emma's eyes found David's across the table whenever she made a joke. The way David's voice became warmer when he spoke to her directly. The way they both seemed more animated, more alive, when they were in each other's presence. How had I missed this for months? How had I sat through family dinners and group outings without noticing that my husband and my sister were falling in love right in front of me? The answer, I realized, was that I'd been trained not to see it. Years of being told that I was paranoid, that I was overthinking things, that I was imagining problems that didn't exist, had taught me to distrust my own perceptions.
Emma and David hadn't just been hiding their affair, they'd been gaslighting me into ignoring the evidence of my own eyes. After dessert, while Jake was in the kitchen making coffee and the other guests were settling into the living room with their wine, I made my move. "Emma," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the apartment, "could I talk to you and David for a moment? There's something I need to discuss with both of you." Emma looked slightly surprised but nodded. "Of course, what's on your mind?" I waited until I had the attention of everyone in the room. Not because I wanted to humiliate Emma and David publicly, but because I wanted witnesses. I wanted people who would remember this conversation, who would be able to confirm later that I'd presented facts rather than accusations, that I'd been calm and rational rather than hysterical. I pulled the folder from my purse and set it on Emma's coffee table with deliberate care. "I found something interesting on David's laptop last week," I said. "I thought you both should know that I'm aware of what's been happening between you." The silence that followed was the kind that seems to stretch time, making seconds feel like minutes. I watched David's face go pale, watched Emma's perfect composure crack around the edges, watched Jake in the kitchen doorway, holding a coffee pot and looking confused. David found his voice first. "Sarah, I don't know what you think you found, but I opened the folder and pulled out the first email, the one where Emma had written about not being able to stop thinking about the night before when Sarah went to get dessert." I read it aloud in the same tone I might have used to read a grocery list. The effect was immediate and devastating. Emma sat down heavily on her couch, her face flushed with what looked like panic. David started to speak, then stopped, apparently realizing that there was no innocent explanation for what I'd just read. Jake set down the coffee pot and walked slowly into the living room. "What is this?" he asked, his voice careful and controlled in the way that suggested he was working hard to maintain his composure. I handed him the folder. "It's emails between your fiancé and my husband," I said. "They've been having an affair for at least 3 months. They're planning to leave us both and start a life together." Jake took the folder with hands that shook slightly, and I watched his face change as he read through the evidence I'd compiled. Our other guests sat in stunned silence, clearly unsure whether they should leave or stay, or pretend they hadn't heard what was happening. "This can't be real," Emma said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah, this is insane. You can't possibly believe that David and I would do something like this." Even now, even with the evidence literally in Jake's hands, Emma was trying to gaslight me, trying to make me doubt my own sanity, rather than admit to what she'd done. I pulled out my phone and showed her the pictures I'd taken of David's car in her parking lot. "I have photos of David's car here on 3 different occasions when he told me he was working late," I said. I have text messages between you discussing when it would be safe to meet. I have emails where you talk about using your spare key to let him into the apartment while Jake is at work. Emma looked at the photos and something in her expression finally broke. The perfect composure, the innocent confusion, the wounded sister act, all of it crumbled, leaving behind something raw and desperate and almost ugly. "Sarah, please," she said, "you don't understand. We never meant for this to happen, but you didn't try to stop it from happening either," I said. "You've been lying to me for months, both of you. You've been giving me advice about how to save my marriage while you were actively destroying it." David finally spoke, his voice hoarse with what might have been guilt or might have been fear. "Sarah, I know how this looks, but it's not what you think. Emma and we have a connection that I've never felt with anyone else. I never meant to hurt you." The words were so similar to what he'd written in his emails to Emma that I wondered if he'd rehearsed this conversation, if they'd planned what to say if they ever got caught. "You're right," I said. "You never meant to hurt me, you just didn't care whether you hurt me or not. There's a difference." Jake had finished reading through the folder and was looking at Emma with an expression of complete devastation. "3 months," he said. "You've been planning to leave me for 3 months, and I had no idea." "Jake," Emma said, reaching toward him, but he stepped back like her touch might burn him. "Don't," he said, "just don't. I can't look at you right now." The other guests had started quietly gathering their things, clearly wanting to escape the awful intimacy of watching two relationships implode simultaneously. I didn't blame them. If I'd been in their position, I would have wanted to leave too. But I wasn't finished yet. "Emma," I said, "I want you to know that finding out about the affair wasn't the worst part of all this. The worst part was realizing that you've been manipulating me for months. You've been sitting across from me at coffee shops and restaurants, listening to me cry about my marriage, giving me advice about being patient with David, all while you knew exactly why he was being distant." Emma was crying now, her perfect makeup streaking down her cheeks in a way that made her look younger and more vulnerable but not more sympathetic. "I was trying to protect you," she said. "I didn't want you to get hurt." The audacity of that statement, the sheer breathtaking selfishness of it made me laugh out loud. "You were trying to protect yourself," I said. "You wanted to have your affair without the inconvenience of dealing with the consequences. You wanted to keep me calm and unsuspecting while you figured out how to steal my husband without looking like the villain." "That's not true," Emma said, but her voice lacked conviction. Even she seemed to realize how hollow her words sounded. I stood up and smoothed down my red dress, feeling strangely calm despite the emotional carnage happening around me. "David," I said, "I've already filed for divorce. My lawyer has copies of all the evidence I showed you tonight. You'll be hearing from her early next week." David looked stunned, like he'd never considered that I might take action rather than simply accepting his betrayal. "Sarah, we need to talk about this," he said. "We need to figure out how to handle this situation like adults." "We are handling it like adults," I said. "I'm handling it like an adult who refuses to be lied to and manipulated anymore. You're handling it like an adult who got caught cheating and is trying to minimize the consequences." I picked up my purse and walked toward the door, then paused and turned back to address the room one final time. "Jake," I said, "I'm sorry you had to find out this way. You deserve so much better than someone who would treat you like Emma has been treating you." To David and Emma, I said, "I hope you're very happy together. I hope the relationship you built on lies and betrayal turns out to be everything you dreamed it would be." And with that, I left. I walked out of Emma's perfect apartment, past the carefully arranged candles and the remnants of the dinner party that had turned into a reckoning, and I felt something that I hadn't felt in months. I felt free. The next few weeks were a blur of lawyers and paperwork and difficult conversations with family members who couldn't believe what David and Emma had done. Some people took sides, some people tried to stay neutral, and some people simply didn't know how to respond to a situation that was so far outside the boundaries of normal family dysfunction. My parents were devastated, not just by the affair but by the way Emma had manipulated the entire family while it was happening. My mother cried for hours when I told her what had happened, apologizing over and over for not seeing what was going on, for not protecting me from my own sister. But their reaction wasn't what mattered to me anymore.
What mattered was that I'd taken control of my own story, that I'd refused to be the victim of other people's choices, that I'd stood up for myself in a way that made it impossible for anyone to dismiss or minimize what had been done to me. David tried to reconcile several times, sending flowers and letters and showing up at my door with apologies that felt more like negotiations than genuine remorse. He seemed to think that if he could just find the right words, the right gestures, he could convince me to forgive him and take him back. But I was done being married to someone who had demonstrated so clearly that I was disposable to him. I was done trying to save a relationship with someone who had been willing to throw it away for someone else. Emma tried to reach out too, through mutual friends and family members who thought we should work things out for the sake of family harmony. She wanted to explain her side of the story, to help me understand that she'd never intended for things to go as far as they had. I wasn't interested in her explanations. There was nothing she could say that would change what she'd done, nothing that would make her betrayal acceptable or forgivable. Some lines once crossed, couldn't be uncrossed. 6 months later, David and Emma were living together in a downtown apartment, trying to build the life they'd planned while destroying mine. I heard through family gossip that they were struggling, that the relationship that had seemed so passionate and inevitable when it was forbidden, was proving to be more complicated when it was their actual reality. I wasn't surprised. A relationship built on deception and betrayal probably wasn't the most solid foundation for lasting happiness. But their problems weren't my concern anymore. My divorce was finalized on a Tuesday in spring, and I celebrated by signing a lease on a beautiful one-bedroom apartment with huge windows and hardwood floors and no memories of David or Emma anywhere in it. For the first time in my adult life, I was living completely alone, and instead of feeling lonely, I felt peaceful. I started dating again, slowly and carefully, learning to trust my instincts about people instead of dismissing them. I made new friends, pursued hobbies that I'd abandoned during my marriage, traveled to places I'd always wanted to see but had never made time for. And every morning, I put on my wedding ring. Not the one that David had given me, which I'd returned to him along with everything else that reminded me of our relationship. But a new ring that I'd bought for myself, a simple band that represented my commitment to never again making myself smaller or quieter or more convenient for someone who didn't deserve my love. The ring reminded me every day that I was enough, exactly as I was. That I didn't need someone else's validation to have worth, someone else's love to have value, someone else's approval to take up space in the world. I thought sometimes about the Sarah who had trusted blindly, who had made excuses for other people's bad behavior, who had been so afraid of being alone that she'd accepted being invisible instead. That woman felt like a stranger to me now, someone I remembered fondly but could never go back to being. Because I'd learned something important from having my life destroyed by the two people I loved most. Sometimes the most devastating betrayals are also the most liberating. Sometimes losing everything you thought you wanted is how you discover what you actually need. And what I needed, it turned out, was to be seen and valued and respected by someone who would never take those things away from me. Someone who would never make me doubt my own perceptions, never ask me to accept lies as truth, never treat my love like it was something disposable. That someone, I'd realized, had to be me first. Everything else could come later, or not at all. But I would never again hand over my sense of self-worth to someone else, never again let another person's choices determine my value. Standing in my new apartment on that Tuesday evening, watching the sunset paint my windows gold, I thought about how strange it was that finding my wedding ring in Emma's jewelry box had led me here. To this place where I felt more myself than I'd felt in years, more confident in my own judgment, more certain of my own worth. The ring I'd lost had been a symbol of promises that were broken before I even knew they were in danger. The ring I wore now was a symbol of promises I'd made to myself, promises that no one else could break because no one else had the power to make them. I was 30 years old, divorced, estranged from my sister, and starting my life over from scratch. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I was exactly where I wanted to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.